The next step is we're going to make occlusal rims on this denture base plates that we had cured, we had seated on the casts. So for this, the armamentarium that is required to make occlusal rims is that we need sheets of wax. This sheet of wax is called base plate wax, and we'll be using this to make occlusal rims. Next is we'll need a flat spatula. We'll also need a scale, a ruler. This ruler is going to give us an idea on how much is going to be the measurement for that occlusal rim. We'll need a burner, spirit lamp or a Bunsen burner for that matter. And we'll also need a flat surface such as a glass slab so that the occlusal rim can be checked that if it's made flat or not. And now when we start making the occlusal rims, we'll be using this base plate wax, the spirit lamp. And how we're going to use it is that we'll be placing the tip, the border of this occlusal rim, this base plate wax, on the spirit lamp, and we'll just slowly heat it up. And when it slowly heats up, we're not going to melt this base plate wax, we're just going to soften it up by heating it up slowly. And we'll keep on moving. As you can see, there's some shiny surfaces coming up. Now we can mold this base plate wax into a small bead like this, and we start molding. Make sure that there is no gap in between. We start rolling slowly, keep on rolling all over. Now as I can feel that there is something hard, the base plate wax where it wasn't softened, now it's hard. So I'll reheat it up again. Slightly soften this up also. Roll, make a roll. Slightly heat it more. And one sheet of wax is adequate to make occlusal rims for both the maxilla and the mandible. You don't need an extra sheet for this. One sheet of base plate wax is good enough to fulfill this purpose. So make sure that you're rolling it in a proper way so that there's no gaps and you can feel the stiffness of the roll once it's complete. So now I've rolled this sheet of wax and I can now bend it into a U-shaped form to adapt it on the base. So after I've made this roll, I'll soften it up slightly so that I can extend it, elongate it in order to compensate for if there are any shortcomings in the length of this base plate wax. So I'll slightly elongate it, make it more cleaner, more smoother. And in this way, now that I've made this roll of wax, now it's now ready to be adapted on the base plate wax. The next step is that we'll be softening this roll of base plate wax. And if you can see that there is a crease where the base plate wax had ended, although we've tried to make it smooth as much as possible. So what we do is that when we are going to make the occlusal rim for the maxilla, we won't be covering the maxillary tuberosity region. We'll be covering some part of the maxillary tuberosity, but we'll be taking it forward over the alveolar bone and come to the other part of the maxillary tuberosity, but we won't be covering it completely. So for this, I'll be softening it. The part which has a crease, the area of the roll which has a crease, I'll be softening that part and I'll be adapting it into a U-shaped arch on this maxillary base plate. There you go. So after I've done this, I'll cut out the excess area and we'll be using this part for the mandibular base plate. Now after I've adapted it, we have to make sure. Now this is the initial presentation of how the base plate and the occlusal rim would appear. Let me just adapt it a little bit more here. There. Okay, so it's adapted on the surface. Now in order to refine this, we must know certain measurements that we need to fulfill in order to make the proper length. The ideal length of an occlusal rim in the interior aspect is supposed to be 22 millimeters. Now this 22 millimeters is from the flange, the top of the flange, in the labial flange, and start measuring till you reach the 22 millimeters or whatever the level of the occlusal rim would be. So by taking this, with the help of his ruler, holding it here, I'll mark the surface, and this is the area where it's 22 millimeters. Similarly, I'll mark on this side also, from this side, from the top of the flange on the labial sulcus, labial flange, 22 millimeters marked. Check it here again. Is this 22 or not? No, it's a little bit, I marked a little earlier. This is 22 millimeters over here. In the anterior, it's going to be 22 millimeters from the top of the flange to the occlusal rim. Then the excess will be reducing. In the posterior region, from the top of the flange, the total length is going to be 18 millimeters. So 18 millimeters we'll mark here. This is just a little bit of occlusal rim that is left. This depicts that the amount of alveolar bone resorption is not that much. The other side, let's see how much length is there going to be. So checking here, 18 millimeters comes up to here. Now over here, if you see, the occlusal rim still has certain amount of wax which is present, but over here there's not much of wax. So this is a clear indication that in the edentulous arch, the level of the alveolar bone changes with age and with time after extraction. So we can easily depict which side, which having a greater length of the alveolar bone, we can easily depict that the time of extraction is recent as compared to the other side. Now once we've done this, we'll be using the help of the flat spatula, and I'll be reducing the occlusal rim till the height, till the mark that I've made on the occlusal rims with the measurement. That is, on the posterior side it's going to be 18 millimeters. In the anterior, in the labial flange, from the top of the labial flange, it's going to be 22 millimeters on both sides. Similarly, on the other side, from the top of the flange on the buccal aspect in the posterior region to the 18 millimeter mark on the occlusal rim, that's where we're going to take the height of this occlusal rim. The rest of it I'm going to just remove with the help of the warm spatula. Now I'll be taking this mark continuously so that I know where I'm going to reduce this occlusal rim. So we'll warm the spatula over the spirit lamp, and slightly with the help of this I'll start melting out the excess wax from this occlusal rim. So this is all I need. I need to remove this excess wax from this occlusal surface, keeping in mind that I follow the same line that I had marked on this occlusal rim. The benefits of making the occlusal rims is manifold. Remember that when the patient has lost his teeth, the patient will have lost his guidance on where to close his jaws. Similarly, without the tooth in the jaws, the patient is going to lose his lip support also. Then the lip tends to fall inwards. So the help of the making of this occlusal rim is going to help us in, first of all, obtaining and maintaining the lip support that had been lost due to loss of teeth. Similarly, it's going to help us in maintaining in recording the jaw relations, which is going to maintain the height, the separation of the upper and the lower jaws at a particular distance between each other, and that is going to be fulfilled with the help of this occlusal rim. Thirdly, these occlusal rims are going to help us in placement of the artificial teeth. Now these are going to guide us where and what is going to be the position and angulation of the teeth of all the anterior as well as the posterior directions. So I have obtained the length which is required, finish a little more. Now if you see over here, there's a gap here in between this base plate and this occlusal rim. Similarly, there is also a rough surface that we need to blend the base plate and the occlusal rim together. Similarly, we need to blend this surface so that it makes a single plane. So for this, we will be adding a sheet of wax in the surface in between here, and then I'll be softening it up with with the help of this spatula and make it a smooth surface. There has to be certain angulations also. So in the anterior aspect, as you can see, the alveolus is slightly proclined forward. So we need to follow the same pattern of this proclination. So the angulation from the vertical, this inclination and the anterior aspect is around 105 degrees. In the posterior region, this is going to be total 90 degrees straight from in the vertical direction. Similarly, on both sides in the posterior region, there is going to be no angulation, but the occlusal rim is going to be perpendicular to the horizontal plane. But in the anterior region, the occlusal rim is slightly proclined as compared to the horizontal plane. So for this, I'll be adding some excess sheet of wax which is present. We won't be using that much of a sheet of wax. We'll only be using where it's required, and that's it. Softening it up on this spirit lamp. I've just rolled it up so that it covers up this gap. Take a little bit more sheet of wax. There. So I've added this wax over here. Keep this in safekeeping. Now, with the help of a spatula, I'm going to blend it in a forward direction. And clean it up, excess, we'll clean it up so that it's easy to make it again. Remember, whenever you're doing an exercise like this, the spatula tends to stick to the surface because it's hot and it tends to hold the surface. So always use a clean spatula before you commence with the next assignment. So we'll be using the same technique. Now, if I want to make it proclined, I will have to keep my spatula in a proclined direction also, so that if I keep it straight, this excess wax, the spatula is going to blend, is going to remove the excess wax in the direction I'm keeping the spatula in. So if I keep it in a direction like this, the wax is going to be removed in the same manner. That means that the top layer will be removed first, and the incisal layer would be removed in the last. So with the help of the angulation of the spatula, we can control the direction and we can control the inclination of the occlusal rims. I'm trying to smoothen it out. Wherever there's a gap, I'll be covering it up with another layer of wax later on. Normally it covers up by itself when the wax melts. Or if I see that there is still some discrepancy in some gaps, I can add a little bit more sheet before we finalize this. Just add a little bit more from the areas where it's deficient. We'll add a bit more, and then we can finish it up later on. So with the help of this spatula, I'll be smoothing out the surfaces. So after I've adapted this excess sheet of wax, I'll be smoothing out the surface. We keep the spatula straight in those areas where it's required to be, where the occlusal rim is supposed to be required to be straight. And we keep the spatula at an angle in those areas where we want the occlusal rim to be at some proclined angle. And in the anterior region, the proclination angle is around 105 degrees from the vertical. So with the help of slight melting of this wax, I'll be covering up the gaps also. Now, once you're looking from the top side, you must make sure that the occlusal rim, outer border of the occlusal rim follows the border and the shape of the flange of the labial side. It shouldn't be that if the flange is more in a U-shaped appearance, your occlusal rim is following a squarish form, or it's more following more of a circular form. So it should follow the shape of the flange. In this way, you can make sure that you are able to create a proper lip support for your particular patient. Now I can see from here that there is some wax deficient here, so I'll add this wax slightly over in this area so that to cover up this deficiency. This padding here. Now this can happen at times, but most of the time this does not happen. So we just cover up this deficiency that has happened. So we must make sure that all the surface is smooth as much as possible. Following the outer contour of this flange, I can easily see that the labial flange of this denture base and the occlusal rim are in the same plane, they're in the same shape also. This way you will be able to very clearly and easily create the lip profile of the patient. So finalizing this occlusal rim on this side, as there was some excess wax, I'll be removing this wax. So now I've done some finishing from the labial and the buccal side. Now I'll be coming to the palatal side. Now if you see on the palatal side, there is a step over here. Now the dimension of the occlusal rim in the posterior region, the width of the occlusal rim in the posterior region is supposed to be 7 to 8 millimeters, 8 to 9 of millimeters. So if I see that this is the right dimension, but over here it's slightly more, so we need to reduce it slightly more. You can trim it from the inner side, you can trim from the outer side, whatever area you feel that it's more of a problem. The other thing that you must make sure that you are supposed to keep the occlusal rim, the center of the occlusal rim on the crest of the alveolar bone, of the top of the crest of the alveolar surface. So this area is more or less on the surface, on the crest of the alveolar bone, but this one is slightly away. So I'll reduce more from the outer side so that I can easily bring it on the crest of the alveolar surface. So from the anterior aspect, we need to reduce it more. The thickness or the width of the occlusal rim in the anterior aspect is around 5 to 7 millimeters. In the posterior region, this is supposed to be around 8 to 9 millimeters, but in the anterior region, this is supposed to be between 5 to 7 millimeters. Now that I've adjusted the labial surface, so I'll be reducing more on the palatal aspect. And when I'm doing this, I'll be keeping in mind that the angulation of the occlusal rim from the anterior aspect in the palatal region is going to be more proclined towards the labial aspect, just like I've done on the labial surface, that I've made a slight proclination. So the same kind of proclination would be present on the palatal aspect. Now, why do we do this? Is because we are going to compensate for the position of the central incisors. As we know that the central incisors are slightly proclined, and we are going to create the same amount of space and the same amount of angulation which is more present for the central incisors or the anterior teeth. So I'll be reducing the wax from the inner side, keeping in mind that I'm also blending the surface with the denture base plate. You need to blend it also, so that whenever you place this occlusal rim in the patient's mouth, the patient is supposed to be feeling comfortable with the occlusal rim. He or she should not feel as if the mouth has been filled up with a certain artificial material. So otherwise, they would be unable to give you a proper jaw relation record. So we try to make the occlusal rims as much close to the width and the thickness of the natural teeth as possible, so that it gives the patient a sense of comfort rather than an uncomfortable appearance. As you can see here, I'm blending the wax in the anterior region. Similarly, wax is flowing, but I'm also slightly reducing. Similarly, I'm also reducing the width of the occlusal rim from the anterior aspect. We remove the excess wax. We're not going to cut off the excess wax, as it might reduce the desired length that we had recorded. Now that I've finished the shape, let me just see how much measurements are there. Over here, this is still more. I can reduce it slightly from the palatal aspect, or I can reduce it slightly from the buccal aspect, depending on that if the center of my occlusal rim is on the center of the alveolar bone, then I will reduce from that particular side, which is excess. Similarly, I'll be measuring from the anterior aspect. This is around 8 millimeters, so I can reduce it slightly more. So we bring it around 7 millimeters. That's an acceptable width of this for the central incisors and then for the incisor teeth. We follow the same contour, we follow the same angulation, and we follow the same curvature that is present on the labial aspect. We are supposed to make sure that we don't over reduce. And now, since I've done this, we will be removing the excess wax which has accumulated because of melting. So after I've removed the excess wax, I'll be finishing and finalizing the proper shape of the occlusal rim. I've removed excess wax from the palatal side. I'll be clearing it more. Smoothing it up. Shouldn't be any voids or any creases. Make it as neat as possible. So we're also going to make sure that there are no wax present on the palatal aspect, like here. Remove all of this. Make sure that there's no wax on the inner side. This might also cause problems to the patient if you are doing a live patient. The patient is going to be having difficulty. Similarly, remove excess wax from the palatal aspect. Clear it up, clean it up. There you go. Now I've smoothened up everything. Remove excess wax everywhere there is present. Knead it, and we place this in some cold water so that we solidify this wax before we start using it. So now I've made the occlusal rim for the maxilla. Now we'll be coming for the making of the occlusal rim for the mandible. So the mandible will be using the same roll of wax that we had made and softening it up on this spirit lamp. We'll bend it also in form of a U-shaped, and what we are supposed to make sure that the occlusal rim does not come on the location of the retromolar pad. So we'll be placing the occlusal rim slightly ahead of the retromolar pad, make it a U-shaped before we start placing on the occlusal surface or on the base plate. Now with this, I'll be slightly softening it up also from the side which is going to be attached on the crest of the alveolus. So I'll be placing it here, making sure that this occlusal rim is on the crest of the alveolar bone. It's not away from the alveolar bone. Similarly, this should come on the center of the ridge. Similarly, over here, I'll adapt it and it should come on the center of the ridge, like this. And similarly over here. So same situation, same finishing procedure is going to be undertaken. We'll be blending it, we'll be blending this junction of the base plate and the occlusal rim so that it doesn't lift during any clinical procedures. Now, in order to finish this up, the height of the occlusal rim in the mandible is slightly different from the height which was present in the maxilla. In the anterior aspect, from either side of the labial frenum, the height is supposed to be around 18 millimeters. And in the posterior region, it's from the maximum depth of the buccal sulcus, the height is supposed to be around 18 millimeters. Similarly, on both sides. So the height is supposed to be 18 millimeters all around, and the width of the occlusal rim from on all aspects is supposed to be around 7 to 8 millimeters in the posterior region, 7 to 8 millimeters in the posterior region on both sides, and anteriorly it's going to be around 5 to 7 millimeters, the same way that we had adjusted for the maxilla. So also, we are also going to make sure that the interior angulation is not going to be proclined, it's going to be more in a vertical location. So we can add a sheet of wax on both sides so that it blends in and makes a smooth surface, the way similar as we had done for the maxilla. You can use a sheet of wax here. Bend it, slightly soften it up, heat it up, and then adapt in between. In those areas where it's required and where there's a gap. Similarly, we'll also add from the lingual aspect. This helps us in making this occlusal rim as smooth as possible. Shouldn't be any voids, any gaps. And we also make sure that the occlusal rim is not coming on the surface of the retromolar pad. Okay, so now we measure the length from the deepest part of the sulcus. Over here, this is coming around 22 centimeters or 20 millimeters. So I'll reduce it. I'll come to a point. Similarly, over here, it's more than, it's around 20 millimeters also. We'll reduce it to this side also. So same procedure that we're going to do is we'll be heating up the spatula. So now I'm heating the spatula so that I can finish up this occlusal rim. I'm going to keep it straight now in this mandible. In the maxilla, I had kept it at an angle. So keeping it straight, we are facilitating the position of the future location of the mandibular central incisors, as they are slightly in a straighter direction as compared to the anterior teeth in the maxilla. Now that is because we want to create an overjet or similarly we want to create an incisal guidance in the complete denture. That is why we require to keep the central incisors or the anterior teeth in a straighter direction. But it's not exactly straight, but slightly in a straighter direction as compared to the maxillary anterior teeth. Now I'll be reducing the height of this occlusal rim and bringing it around 18 millimeters all around. As I had checked that the height of the occlusal rim in all aspects was more than 20 millimeters, so I'll reduce it, make it straight. Now I'll be finishing from the inner side also. Now I'll smooth out this occlusal rim, keeping in mind there's no voids, the surface is all smooth. You can use a spatula, but for this purpose I'm using a wax knife as it's more easier to use in this area. So let's measure the length of the occlusal rim from the interior aspect. It's around, so yes, here it's around 18 millimeters. Similarly, in this side we have 18 millimeters. Oops, it's sticking because it's hot. Make sure that the surface is all smooth. I need to soften it up and clear it up again. Here it's around 18 millimeters. Oops, it's again sticking. That means that this occlusal wax is still hard, is still soft, hasn't hardened so far. So we measure here. This is around 18 millimeters. Similarly, on this side, around 18 millimeters. So the other aspect that you need to measure is the width. So in the posterior region, we have a width of around 8 millimeters on this side. We have a width of around 8 millimeters on this side. And in the anterior region, we have a width of around slightly more than 7. So I'll reduce it from this inner side. Okay, the other aspect that you need to understand and you need to know is the location of the retromolar pad area. On the cast, you'll be marking the retromolar pad. This is a pear-shaped area which is present in the most posterior region of the mandibular arch. This is the most posterior limit of the mandibular denture. So this is the retromolar pad area. At the junction of the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the retromolar pad, we are going to mark as if this is the junction of the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the retromolar pad. I'll be making a line, a mark, and I'll be extending it outwards to the surface. Similarly, at this side, if this is the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3, I'm making a mark, taking it outside. Similarly, in order to create the center of the ridge of this mandibular denture, take the pencil, mark here and a flat line, and it's automatically marking the crest of the ridge at one single point. So this area, this is going to denote that the position of the mandibular posterior teeth are going to be on this crest of the ridge. So once I place this, I've made a mark on the cast, and there is some wax underneath I can feel, so I missed that step. So you mustn't miss this step, and you must be careful that once you've done this completed making of the occlusal rim, always remove the excess wax from the surfaces which does not require the presence of wax. So I've removed excess wax from all of the surfaces, made sure, and we'll place it again and just check that if it seats in properly. Yes, now it's seating properly. Now, we are supposed to make sure that the height of the occlusal rim, although it's measuring in the maximum depth of this buccal sulcus, it's around 18 millimeters, but we're supposed to make sure that the occlusal rim comes at this junction of the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the retromolar pad, which I had marked on the retromolar pad and extended that line on the cast. So if I see over here, you can see that the scale is coinciding with that same position on the occlusal rim. This is absolutely important. You are supposed to bring the height of the occlusal rim at this level. And this height of the occlusal rim is supposed to maintain throughout the same procedure, and we check on the same side for the other side of the mandible, as you can see that it's going slightly raised up. I'll reduce it more from this side. Checking again. Let's see if it has reached that surface. Yes. Now we can be sure that this is at the same level. So with this, we've come to the completion of making of occlusal rims. And now the next step is going to be articulation of these occlusal rims on the semi-adjustable articulator, and the next step is, after that, is going to be setup of teeth.